And with that, please welcome back to the podium, Dave Skuodas.
Thank you, Holly. It's an odd form of punishment to get to be the last speaker of the day, but thank you all for sticking with me. It's a pretty interesting story we need to tell. Now, remember how I said earlier you should get rid of old clothes every now and then? Well, one thing to never get rid of is great content. I am a connoisseur of great content, a collector of great content, and the 2013 floods were an absolute treasure trove. We had flood damage and tragedy and lessons learned, so many stories to tell. It was hard to narrow this down, but I promise I did. I'm not going to talk that long. But with it being the 10-year anniversary, we thought it would be a good time to look back. Where did the flood validate the work we'd been doing all those years? Where did it illuminate things we needed to improve, and what have we improved since? Well, the foundation of our work is protection. It's about safety, keeping floods outdoors rather than indoors, because when floods go indoors, it creates trauma. You know, floods are the most destructive natural disasters on the planet. They cause full-on trauma, and we get to work to prevent that, this sort of thing, from happening, because ideally a flood is a spectator event, a spectacle of nature that we can appreciate from afar. Maybe you stop and look at it for a few minutes and then you go about your day. Well, 10 years ago, some of you weren't in Colorado at all or weren't working in our industry yet. So let's start with the beginning of the story, the rainfall. And here's a map of the rainfall totals, a courtesy of our alert system that did its job swimmingly. The entire metro area got dumped on. All the red is 3 inches or more of rain. Now, the point rainfall we use for our 100-year runoff is around 3 inches, but we distribute that over a 2-hour period, not a week. And the hardest hit areas were in Aurora and Boulder, which had 15 to 18 inches of rain. And so for those of you that weren't here, you got to imagine that this rainfall was happening during the CASFM conference. And how many of you were up in Steamboat Springs? Yes, all up in Steamboat Springs, where it was like maybe a little cloudy. So this was like a very, very strange thing to wake up to on like Wednesday or Thursday of the conference. And this graphic by Wright Water engineers from a rain gauge on Skunk Creek in Boulder paints the picture really well. You can see 5-minute incremental depth on the left and then total depth on the right. Our design storm gets as intense as around 7.5 inches per hour, but the 2013 event at this particular gauge only had a max of around 2.5 inches per hour. So it was the total that bit us and caught up to us. So by the time you get to this peak, it had already rained 3 inches. By the time you get to these peaks, it had already rained 6 inches. So reservoirs and detention basins were full, ground was saturated, everything became runoff. So it became a geological event as much as a meteorological event. You know, it's natural for streams to move, but it's pretty shocking to see it happen in real time. A new sedimentary rock getting created from all the landslides. The debris was voluminous, both sediment and vegetation, and sadly, people's possessions. You know, driving around afterwards, it was like a messed up post-apocalyptic yard sale of some sort. We were in emergency mode for about a week because it took a while for the flows to recede. It didn't just happen overnight. So we had to keep people out of harm's way. And then the recovery started. We had to move streams back so that they would flow to the bridges and culverts rather than around them. We cleaned up an epic amount of debris. And we've heard us talk a lot about relationships today, and it's important to have established relationships before an emergency. It's a lot more helpful. And I can't say enough about how consultants and contractors really stepped up to help in any way they could at a time when anybody with an engineering scale or an excavator was in high demand. And you all answered our calls and really kept your prices fair. Now, sadly, we did lose 8 lives in Colorado, in the state during this flooding, including 2 fatalities within the district. It was this 19-year-old couple named Wesley and Wiana. They were visiting friends up 2 Mile Canyon west of Boulder, and on their way back, their car got stalled in a mudslide. Wiana got out and got swept away. Wesley went after her, and he got swept away as well. And so we do a good job of protecting people and property from floods, but driving into a flooded road is still the most likely cause of death in a flood in the U.S. We had a few other near misses that I'll highlight that we learned some things from. On Westerly Creek at 13th Avenue, an older gentleman and his dog got sucked into this culvert despite the safety grate. So yeah, they got sucked under that. And to top it off, he was a blind man. And this isn't a short culvert. It goes for 2,000 feet. It makes 4 90-degree turns. So he wasn't in there for seconds. This ride would have lasted for a few minutes. And by some miracle, he and his dog came out the other end without drowning. Now, Ken and Holly visited this site afterwards, and they figured out the problem was that there was too big of a gap under the safety grate. So post-flood, we added these 2 horizontal bars, and then this site spurred the new safety grate research that Holly spoke about at last year's symposium. We had another close call at this safety grate on Wonderland Creek at 28th Street in Boulder. And debris clogged the grate at an already undersized crossing. And guess where the water goes if it doesn't go in the culvert? Well, that's right, it goes right into that building beyond that has garden-level units. And a retiree lived there with her dog, and she must be a heavy sleeper because she didn't wake up until her mattress was floating around the room with her on it. Some neighbors helped her escape, but they couldn't find the dog. She screamed for them to go back, but the floodwaters were coming in the back door and pushing the front door shut, and they were afraid of getting trapped, so they weren't able to go back. But the next day, they came back, and the dog was safe and sound, floating around on the mattress, its tail a wagging. I'll bet something fierce. We did have a capital project in design when the flood happened. In addressing flood risk after a community has developed is expensive and messy in every way imaginable. The project took around 10 years and around $30 million, but we got it done in 2018. So if a similar flood ever happened again, that building would be safe and sound, and we've protected trail users with the new underpass. So we got function and conveyance. Everybody wins. On Rock Creek at Dillon Road in Boulder County, there was an old corrugated metal pipe culvert without proper head walls and wing walls. So the floodwater eroded around the pipe and then completely took out a section of road and then picked up the pipe and deposited it downstream that you see right there. And this is a pretty flat section of road. This happened in the dark in the early morning hours, so people just went over the edge unbeknownst. And 3 drivers ended up going over and had to get rescued, like this poor fellow who spent an uncomfortable amount of time in his car standing on the roof of the inside of his overturned car to find an air pocket to breathe. In the aftermath, Boulder County replaced the crossing with a 100-year crossing with sturdy head walls and wing walls that will be there for the next flood. All right, back to Boulder along South Boulder Creek. This area has a long history of flooding, as you can see from these photos from 1969, followed by some development in risky areas, with this being the mapped flood risk, shocker. No judgment, stuff happens. In 2013, floodwaters came into the Fraser Meadows retirement community, as you see in this video.
And it's rising, I can see it rising. Holy crap. Oh.
It also flooded their underground parking garage, destroying several vehicles. To my knowledge, nobody was hurt here, but it has been a nearly 30-year effort to get community support around a flood mitigation project that involves building a new high-hazard dam upstream of Highway 36. And during a recent virtual public meeting, one of the Fraser Meadows residents made a memorable, now the no-name youth ambassadors are awesome. This guy did something, he took it a different direction. I'm just gonna share a snippet, but he made a memorable argument for the flood mitigation project in the form of a folk song that he wrote. And I wish I had time to play the whole thing because it's kind of amazing, but here's a 25-second snippet.
While at Fraser, our heroic staff kept working through the night, and they rescued all the ill and wheelchair bound. We're apprehensive 'cause another flood could come any day. The question isn't if, but only when. We must work together now to mitigate this threat, so we'll never face a flood like this again.
Gotta love Boulder. This is like, I'm gonna put this whole thing on social media at some point. At the end of the song, you're expecting applause, and it's just like crickets. And it's like this uncomfortable amount of time, and then they just call on the next speaker as if nothing amazing just happened. It was like, all right, like, okay, I know we have formal business to attend to, but let's just pause for a moment and appreciate what just happened. Okay, so we're hoping to start construction on this project next year at a price tag of over $50 million, and it can't get built soon enough. I participated in a public meeting after the flood, a pretty memorable one, with Kurt Bauer and Douglas Sullivan. 150 people showed up, and it was at the Elks Lodge off 26th Street in Boulder. And they had a string quartet playing before the meeting started just to calm the mood. Boulder's one of a kind. And I'll never forget what one resident said, and I don't want to gross everybody out, but the flood impacted a lot of sewer lines. And in some cases, manholes were broken, so floodwater was pouring into sewer lines and pressurizing them. And so this resident in this public meeting got up and described going down into his basement and finding water shooting out of his toilet and hitting his ceiling. So floods are traumatic. Floods are traumatic. They're also very erosive, especially in our sandier systems, because floodwater is not clear water and topography is not static. And Sand Creek is aptly named because it has really fine sediment and it moved, especially near this wastewater treatment plant. These pipes were buried in the bank before it eroded, and just to give you a sense of how big those pipes are, here's one next to an excavator. Wow. So there was a significant project to stabilize this stream bank, and the scour potential at that little area I circled there was so great they had to drive secant piles. And you'll have to look that up. It's just kind of you'll have to look that up. Expensive, deep money, yes. In the aftermath, and a lot of credit goes to Morgan Lynch on spearheading this, we mapped the alluvial hazard zones along Sand Creek, which are different than the flood hazards that assume static topography. So here in red, you can see how much wider the alluvial hazard can be than the blue flood hazard lines. And there hasn't been an easy mechanism to regulate with this mapping, but at least it lets people know their risk. And we spent a lot of time mapping flood risk, as we should, and these maps were quite predictive depending on the type of system we were looking at. Here on Goose Creek and Boulder, you can see the mapped risk in blue, observed flooding in pink, and then the comparison's pretty indistinguishable. The creek has 1D flow, so pretty contained. Now in 4 Mile Canyon Creek, with the sheer amount of sediment and movement, culverts were clogged, and the creek redirected, and shallow flow went all over the place. On Wonderland Creek at Foothills, we don't map ditches and canals with floodplains, but they do take on water, and that's what this flooding depicts. Water that went down the Boulder and White Rock Ditch and then escaped on the other side of Foothills Parkway. I believe this is where the toilet incident happened. And then on South Boulder Creek, this floodplain was mapped with a 2D model years ago, and it very closely modeled what happened. But keep in mind, a lot of this is street flooding, and that topography change would blow up a 2D model just as readily as a 1D model. And in this case, a good map, but they used an expensive 2D modeling software that has made the floodplain difficult to regulate over the years. And you've seen a lot of carnage in Boulder because that city has a crazy amount of flood risk with the way it developed, and solving these issues after the fact is exceedingly difficult. But even still, the projects that were built before the flood did their job, worked amazing. And here are Goose Creek and Elmer's 2 Mile the week after the flood, and this is where I showed you that mapping just a second ago. There was no story to tell here, didn't even need maintenance. These were capital projects that worked. Now, along Westerly Creek, there's been significant investment over the years because of the history of flooding, like here at Montview in the 1970s. And the creek has been studied several times with master plans calling for numerous detention basins throughout the watershed. And these detention basins have been implemented. So here was the plan for Utah Park. It got built as a multi-use facility, and then here it did its job in 2013. And then the plans for Expo Park and its implementation. And note the spill flows on the left, which looked like this during the flood. And the spill looks dramatic, but at least it's a flooded road and not a flooded home. Also a multi-use facility, and that photo on top is from several months post-flood, so this held up really well. Kelly Road Dam, the plans and implementation and utilization. Now, people get jazzed when a spillway gets activated, as well they should, but it often gets confused as being a dam breach or failure, which it is not. We might need to educate the media on that phrase. You heard a lot of talk of dams failing or breaching, and it was just a spillway that was operating. Then the Jewel Wetlands doing its job, and then the monster of Westerly Creek Dam with over 4,000 acre-feet of storage. Now, Alan Turner, when he was at CH2M Hill, and John Valines, when he was at Aurora, they asked an interesting question. They looked at the flood damages avoided because the infrastructure existed. And so at Westerly Creek Dam, you can see the discharges with and without these detention basins. So that 45 CFS shows up all the way down there on the hydrograph on the left. And that's quite a difference. And then they simulated what the flood extents would have been without detention. So without detention on the left, if they didn't exist. And we didn't avoid damages altogether in this watershed. Actual damages are in green, but we avoided around $220 million in damages, the red minus the green. And this just looked in Aurora. It didn't even look downstream in Denver. And just for this one event, you got a benefit to cost ratio of 4.5, let alone for future floods. So this really did its job. And then last but not least, these images age well because they tell a great story. One other area I want to highlight on Westerly Creek is in the Central Park neighborhood. And this used to be the Stapleton Airport with much of the creek entombed in the runways, under the runways there. And as the area redeveloped, it was really one of the first shining examples of preserving a wide enough corridor to facilitate a naturalized design approach. And so as we zoom in on this photo at MLK Boulevard Bridge, you can see what this looked like during the flood, what it looked like the very next day. And I had to cyber stalk this guy that I found these photos from online. He was a resident that just lived nearby. And then back to this photo, which I took 8 months after the flood. 8 months after the flood. So there were no search and rescue operations here, no damaged building or infrastructure. There wasn't even anything to fix post-flood. So this is a picture of high function and low maintenance. And this foundation of safety provides so much credibility to our work, but thankfully it doesn't flood like this very often. I like to say that 99 days out of 100, there is no flood. So what kinds of functions and values are we providing to the community beyond, in addition to flood conveyance? Because when we can preserve corridors like this, we have room for wildlife and trails and recreation, improved water quality, increased infiltration, and it's a place for people to connect with nature. So, bellissimo. So I hope you all enjoyed this stroll down memory lane. It really validated the great work we've all been doing. But the work goes on, and we heard about some amazing work today from all of our speakers. Thank you to all the speakers that spoke today. Efforts to help with workforce and cybersecurity, new approaches to hydrology and outreach and water quality. We heard about a project so big they called it the Water Project. The Water Project. We heard about lessons learned, relationships, land development, molehills, and beavers. Only at the symposium will you get that kind of variety. Big thank you to Derek and Drew and the folks from Encore in the back helping us look and sound good up here. Thank you to the Sheridan for a great venue. To the interns who had the guts to get up here and get in front of the mic and do that, introduce people, that's hard. That's hard to do. Shannon and Rachel that helped with check-in. And then last but not least, Ellie and Holly who do by far the most work to make this event happen. And thank you to everybody who came and for being a part of today. Have a good one.